Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled Poppie. Daniel is an ancient word which is spelling. The spelling of the word has been lost to history. Sometimes I can't even put words together, and I do a lot of writing, though I am a better writer than I am a talker. So if you're listening to this and you're like, you do writing? I'm a bit better writer than I am a talker, and I know that I do stutter a lot. On my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is an epic fantasy adventure alternative history set in 1976 that does not have magic. It's an adventure story. You can check out my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer, which is a crime thriller set in the 1950s, but it's also an alternate timeline. There is a difference between... There's a difference between alternate history, or alternative history is what I think it actually is, but I think you should say alternate history. There's a difference between alternative history and an alternate timeline. Alternative history focuses on the what ifs, and I've said this in the past as well. Alternative history focuses on a what if in history. It says, what if this happened? What if that happens? An alternate timeline just it changes a few things. So, I can't think. So, Man in High Castle is alternative history. Man in High Castle takes on this idea, and it's a bit more than that too, but it is in the line of alternative history because it takes on this idea of what if the Nazis won the Second World War, which didn't happen, thank God. But it takes on that idea and then it runs with it and sees what's going to happen if the Nazis won the Second World War. The games, the Fallout games, if you know what those are, they are actually an alternate timeline, okay? So they are, I don't know what time period they're set in, but they're set in, the culture they're set in is like a 1950s Americana. It's that culture with a lot of hope for the future. It has a lot of happy things going on in it. It's very optimistic, but it's set in this, what would you call it? Not a dystopian. It's a post-apocalyptic world where everything's been destroyed by a nuclear holocaust, right? So that's an alternate timeline because they do take ideas from the 1950s world, but they change it and they make it a different thing entirely. So what I'm writing is less like alternative history asking what if. It's more like creating an alternate timeline with which I can write a story that is, in the end, an adventure story, but it's along the lines of a fantasy epic, if you want to go with that. But again, check out One Last Toast for Ebenezer as well. It is my serialized crime thriller. You can listen to it on this podcast feed. You can check it out on my website and read it. I would personally be reading it if I hadn't written it. Like I would be doing that. I wouldn't be listening to myself, but check that out as well. Word of the week. The word of the week is epicure. Epicure. An epicure is a noun, and it is someone who appreciates good food and drink. Someone who appreciates good food and drink. So what I drink from makes me seem like an epicure, but I would say that I'm not because there are people who enjoy much finer food and drink than me. There was this, I wonder if anybody's ever seen, there's this French, because it's always French, I think he's French. He's a French chef. I don't know if you'd even call him a chef at this time, but he uses syringes and he injects stuff in. It's more of like a chemistry experiment than actually making food. But at the same time, I do enjoy actually eating food instead of just pure sauces, because it seems like once you get high enough, it might taste delicious, right? It's one of those places where it's like your dessert is air. Your dessert is flavored air, and that's what it is. But I prefer actually eating food. I think most of us do. But some of those places, they get really high, and there's like a pea on your plate, and there's like a little tiny bit of sauce that looks kind of fancy, and then there's a bubble of gravy or something like that. I know I'm exaggerating this, but it seems to be the case. The more you pay, the less you get. But what you get is supposed to be the best stuff in the world. My question is are people just lying to themselves, or are they actually getting something better than everybody else is getting? Because I've tasted some pretty unbelievable food for quite cheap in relation to what they're paying for stuff. And I've gone to places that have been fairly expensive that haven't had very good food. So are you paying for the experience, or are you actually paying for good food? And that's the question I want to know. Am I ever going to know that? I don't know, because I don't know if I'm willing to shell out the cash it takes to actually go to one of these places and eat. And I don't know if I'd ever be, no matter how much money I'd make. So we are going to be talking about us, ironically, in this episode. We're going to be talking about using our writing to focus on ourselves, and we're going to be talking about the actual what writing is actually for, because I don't think it is to focus on the writer. And you might be thinking, well, that is kind of a hypocritical statement to say, hey, we shouldn't use our writing to focus on ourselves, because first of all, we make the writing, right? We're the ones who do it, so we should get praise for our writing. Yeah, I think that you should. I think that people should get praised for the work they do. I think that's the case. I don't think you should always get praised. I don't think you should expect praise. Some jobs are thankless, and I think you should expect that, right? There's a certain job where it's like, don't expect to be thanked for this job if you go into that line of work. Somebody might thank you, and that's a bonus, but don't. I think that there are certain jobs where it's like, if you're a parent, your kid might thank you years down the line, but your kid's not going to thank you as they're growing up. Your kid doesn't realize what's going on. Your kid might realize that if they become a parent and they realize, whoa, this is a lot different than I thought it was. But as a parent, I would expect that to be a thankless job, and I wouldn't start a movement to try to get people to be like, oh, yeah, there are certain jobs, it's just like, that's just part of the gig. And there are certain jobs that have a lot of praise. There are certain jobs that people praise people in those professions. It's often case the arts, right? People in movies get tons of praise. People in, you get awards for stuff. People in, in the music industry get tons of praise. Certain people, not everybody. Actually, the majority of people don't. And then there's other jobs that are like, there's movements to be like, oh, this job is so hard. These people, you should thank this person, yada, 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 And I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that. And I'm not a big fan of that because we should as people learn to just do our job and not expect to be praised for it at all times. We shouldn't expect people to be like, oh, you do that? That's unbelievable. I just think it's, the best word I can think of is gauche. I don't know if that would describe it, but it just seems out of, it doesn't seem appropriate. It seems outside of propriety. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So it doesn't seem appropriate for socializing with other people to expect praise like that. And it really doesn't seem appropriate generally to expect praise, especially if you're not getting it. Especially on a, what would you call it, a public stage, and a public platform, I guess maybe I'd call it. So if you're not getting praise for something you're doing, and then you're suddenly like, hey, this job does this and this, I'm okay with making people aware of what a job is like, but you don't know what other people's jobs are like. And when you present a job as being so difficult, you don't know, first of all, if there's another job that's more difficult, and you don't know if there's another job that is less satisfying, less meaningful, and more difficult, and there's people doing it. Does that make sense? So I don't like to, I try not to do this, and I think we're all guilty of this, but I try not to put myself next to another person in what they're like, what I'm doing, and be like, hey, how, like, oh, they have it so better than me, so much better than me, or like, I'm such a victim in this situation because people aren't doing this, in that. I think that it's better to be grateful. And we certainly have a lot to be grateful about. So in terms of not using writing to focus on ourselves, I think that I'm as guilty. If anybody's guilty, I'm as guilty as everybody else. I have a podcast. I do writing. I tell people when I write. I generally tell people that I write things. I don't know if everybody does. I don't know if everybody works the same as me, so I'm not going to make that assumption. But when how I go about things with writing, and maybe this is why it's a turnoff to me because I just don't like attention. But when I go up to somebody, I'll talk to somebody, and I always want people to know. I think that most people who've written a book or are in an artistic field want people to know. But for me, I don't want to just blurt it out. I want the conversation to go there naturally. So if it doesn't, it's often the case that people don't even know what I do, and so they don't know what I do. So once in a while, I'll be like, oh yeah, and I also do this. It's actually something I probably need to work on. But at the same time, I am spotlighting myself. So if we get into that conversation, in the end, it's talking about me. And to a certain degree, you do need to talk about yourself. But I think we can go too far with it. So I realize the irony of this podcast. I realize the irony of being like, oh, we shouldn't spotlight ourselves when I stick a camera on myself, when I mic myself, and I start talking about the fact that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't just have it all focused on us. So here's a few things that maybe you need to think about, and I think need to think about as well, that draw attention toward the writer instead of the work. And you might be thinking, like, why shouldn't we draw attention toward the writer? Well, I'm going to get into that in a second, but I think that first we need to know what those things are that draw attention to the writer instead of what work we're doing. And like I said, I'll explain why I think the work is more important than the writer's extremely important because the writer exists, but the writer writes to create the work. And if the writer was meant to be focused on instead of the work, the writer wouldn't have to create the work. If that makes sense. But here are some things that I see, and this is not necessarily the case just in writing. It's not necessarily the case in the arts in general. If you want to use that broad statement for everything creative, it's not necessarily the case that you're seeing this happen in only these places. It also happens in other areas as well. If you're complaining about what you're doing, right? If you're complaining about your writing, you are, first of all, I don't think anybody really likes another person complaining. People like to complain themselves, and they like to complain with other people about something, but when you're getting complained to, it's an annoying thing, and I think everybody can agree on that, and I think all of us complain, but I think that when you complain about writing, what it does is first of all, you're essentially complaining about a luxury, because if you have the luxury to write, then if you are writing, it's a luxury, right? And some people might be like, but I take like this 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there to write. Well, you have 15 minutes to write. That means you have 15 minutes to spare. That means that you have that wiggle room in your life, and some people don't have that wiggle room. Some people might be like, I've got to just keep on working because that 15 minutes, I got to make sure I have that money, or I've got to make sure if it's more agrarian, I better make sure I keep on working at that time, because if I take that 15-minute break at this period, especially this period of the year, stuff might not work out. I don't know. So there's people who have been in tighter situations than you, and the fact that you can engage in the luxury of writing means that you are in a better situation than a lot of people have been in the history of the world. If you look back at the history of the world, most people weren't doing tons of writing, right? Because most people actually weren't able to read and write. And then as we progress through history and as we've developed more technologies, energy-saving technology, especially when the Industrial Revolution hit, we were able to write more. People were more educated because we had more time, we had more wealth, etc. But if you're complaining about writing, it's focusing it on you, right? And it's essentially saying, oh, this is such a difficult thing, but I'm a writer. Look at me, this is what I do. I'm a writer. I've written this, and this, and I'm 50,000 words into my first draft of whatever, or 50,000 words. And for someone who isn't a writer, 50,000 words is a lot. But when you're someone who is a big writer, when you're someone who's been a writer for 10 years and you have multiple books out, 50,000 words is like, yeah, that's good. That might be a whole entire book. But at the same time, that's just, for some people, that's a fraction of their book. So they might be like, well, yeah, 50,000 words, okay. But you draw attention to yourself. You're not drawing attention to your work, and you're not actually being productive, because generally it's the case that complaining is not productivity. It might be the case in there. I'm not saying that it's never the case that there's a certain complaining is productivity, but in most cases, from what I see, complaining is not productivity. And now here we go. Here's the irony coming out. if you are someone who is excessively talking about writing, specifically your writing, because so I don't want to, if you think that I am completely a complete hypocrite because I talk about writing every single week, I think there is a difference. In some cases, I probably do fall into this, what I'm talking about right now, and in other cases, I don't think I do. If you are talking about writing specifically, and you're always bringing it back to yourself, I think that is focusing the spotlight on you, right? If you're saying, oh yeah, this is what I do, and yada, like, there's different ways of talking about things that draw attention to you, and there's ways of talking about things that draw attention to the thing itself. I try to, and this is one of the reasons why I created this podcast, because in most cases, the podcasts out there drew attention to the writer and the writer's tiny little world, right? And I do use anecdotes from my own life, and I'm aware of that. But I try to take a bigger picture in this podcast. And I guess I'm defending myself right here. I tried to take a bigger picture in this podcast to look at bigger things in writing. And I hope it doesn't come across as if it's all about me when I talk about them. I hope it comes across as if these are bigger things. These are bigger ideas. This is the philosophy. These are the ideas. This is the groundwork that we're working off of, instead of saying, this is a difficult thing I have in writing. This is a difficult thing. Oh man, my what I'm working on right now is super hard. And I definitely have plugs in my podcast for my stuff, which I just hate selling stuff. I'm sorry. But I definitely have that, but I hope that it comes across that I'm not just trying to focus on my difficulties in writing, and I hope that I'm trying to take a broader perspective, and it comes across in that way. But if you're talking excessively, and I guess this gets back into complaining as well, but if you're talking excessively about what you're doing in writing, it's not focusing on your writing, it's focusing on you. It's not focusing on your writing, it's focusing on you. And every time you talk about your writing, and I definitely do at times, it doesn't focus on the writing itself, because the only thing that can focus on the writing itself is if someone actually is reading the writing, or if someone has actually come in contact with your writing. So if you're talking about your writing to a beta reader, or if you're talking about your writing to an editor or someone who's read the book, and you're asking, hey, what can I do better, or different things like that, or what do you think about the book? It's focusing on the writer, because they actually, the book itself, it's focusing on the writing because they actually have context. If you talk about how the writing's going and everything like that, and they've never read the book, they don't actually know. So it's going to go back to you, and that's what I mean right here. The same thing. The next thing that adds to this, that focuses on the writer, is talking about your work in progress. And this is the same idea. If they haven't read the work in progress, it's not focusing on the work in progress. It's focusing on you. I think, I don't know what my next note means. I almost dumped my coffee. I don't know what my next note means. It says what I do for writing. And I think what my note meant was when I was putting stuff out for this, when I was writing stuff down, is what you have to do to make sure you write. So it's like, I had to wake up at this time of the day, or yada yada yada. And I'm not trying to be mean to people. I'm not trying to say you can never do it. I just think it's good to be aware of when you're spotlighting yourself rather than your writing, because I think it is good to collaborate with people. I think it's good to talk to people. I think it's good to get ideas. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think I always try to come from a place of humility. I don't always. I know I don't. I always try to come from a place of humility with my writing. I always try to be like, this isn't about me. Life isn't about me. Other people's lives are about me. Maybe people don't want to hear about this. So I always try to approach it that way. So if I do start a conversation about writing, I need to know that person actually wants to talk about it. I need to know that it's going to be more, and I think I fail at this when it comes up. I need to know that it's going to be more than a one-sided conversation where I'm just talking at somebody, which I think it does happen in a lot of cases. But the reason why I bring this up is because we as writers are similar to painters or sculptors. We're not actors, and musicians are different. Actors and musicians are totally different. Well, actors are similar in a way, and musicians are similar in a way, but they're a little different because they are actively participating in their art. whereas the writer creates the art and then steps back, or the painter creates the art and steps back. Now, the writer does need to exist for the art piece, for the writing to exist. Of course that needs to happen. Art does not fall into place magically. It just doesn't happen. The writer needs to exist. The writer needs to exist for the art to exist. But the writer doesn't need to be present for the art to exist. And I've harped on this again and again and again. I think the goal of your writing is for you to disappear. I think when people read your work, they should not notice you as the writer. And that's a weird thing, because you would say, well, I'm writing a book and I've got a lot of thoughts and I'm putting them in a specific order with specific words. And of course, they're going to notice me when they're reading that book. And I'm talking about fiction specifically. If you're writing a memoir or if you're writing nonfiction, you're going to show through a lot more because you might use the word I or something like that. But when you're writing fiction, when you're doing creative writing, the goal, as I've stated 1,000 times, probably 1,000 times, is that the person thinks your thoughts after you. And if a person is going to think your thoughts after you, then they can't notice that they're doing it. They can't notice that they're doing it. And that's what I mean when I say that you are disappearing as the writer, when they're experiencing what you've written about, what you've written. When they read the book, they aren't thinking, oh, they might think this writer's great, right? But as they read the book, they should be thinking, they should be engrossed in that book. They should slip into whatever world or whatever thought process you've created for them. And a requirement for them to do that is for them to forget about you, for them to forget about the couch they're sitting on, for them to forget about the book they're reading from. The best writers in the world are going to be able to make people forget where they are. And not everybody is capable of actually forgetting where they are, but the best writers in the world are going to be able to make people forget the best they're able to. Make people forget where they are, make people forget their life for 20 minutes, a half an hour, however long they're reading. And then somebody's going to break out of that and they're going to be like, wow, this is really good. But as they're reading, the writer is disappearing. The writer doesn't, after the book has been written, the writer doesn't need to exist. After the book has been written, it's okay if the writer dies, right? That's why we can read things so far in the past. The book, the art form, is the important part. That's why we're writing books, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be writing books. If we're writing books just to spotlight ourselves, and I think every writer should be like, yeah, my book is worth however much money. I'd love to live off of what I'm working on, especially if I've done tons of work toward it. I'm not talking about that aspect of things. I'm talking purely about the art. Because after you die, it doesn't matter. You don't need money to live off of. You're dead. You're not going to eat. You're not going to live anywhere. You're dead. But people can still read your work. And if you write really, really well, hopefully you can become a classic author and people read your work and they forget about you, they forget about the world because of the fact that you've written so well, right? Because of the fact that you've written so well. And in some cases, when you spotlight yourself, you're getting in the way of your art. You're getting in the way of the actual writing because in some cases, there's a lot of different reasons why you might get in the way of your writing, right? You might set up expectations that are different than what people have of your book, right? If somebody comes to your book and they have no expectations, they're gonna start reading it, then they might be like, wow, this is really good. But if you set up your book in a specific way, and this has happened to me with movies or different books where somebody says, hey, where they set something up, the one that comes to my mind most quickly, because when I was a kid, that film, the children's movie, I think it was Disney. Yeah, it was Disney. Lilo and Stitch came out, and the previews didn't present it as it actually was. The previews presented the alien character as getting into other movies, and my siblings and I were like, this looks really cool. Let's go see it. And then we didn't get that story, so they didn't manage our expectations, right? And if you tell nobody about your book, they're not going to have any expectations, or maybe they'll draw their own conclusions about it. But when they read it, then their expectations won't butt up against what you've told them. But if you tell them a lie, if you don't present it in the way that it should be presented, if you don't present it in the way that it actually exists in the world, then they might be like, that's not what I expected, so I didn't actually like it. Because people can expect something and they can dislike something just because they expected something different. And that's the truth. It might be excellent, right? You might write the best book in the world, but somebody expected something different, so they don't actually like it. And that happens when you're watching movies a lot. That happened with it's a cultural touchstone. That's why I use it a lot. That happened with the Star Wars, the new series, right? And it's such a big cultural thing, and everybody knows about it. But that happened with this new Star Wars series where everybody had expectations of where this series was going. They had expectations of the characters, and then the characters were not presented as they were at the last the last episode that was there, episode 6, right? The characters weren't actually who they were. They had changed so much. So there were so many expectations that people had because of the past. And because of those expectations, they didn't like what was in the present. And if the new movies were the best movies in the world, which I don't think they are, if those movies were the best movies in the world and the old characters were completely changed, you'd still get people who are like, I don't like the movies. And the reason why they didn't like the movies is because the characters were changed. Now, movies are a bit more complex than books, but it can still happen in books, right? If you're writing a series and you change your character from one book to the other to a completely different character, somebody who's reading this, a lot of people might be like, that's okay, I like that. But some people might say, this is completely different. There's no continuity here. And they might, even if it's a well-written book, they might say, I don't like it because it doesn't follow from one to the other. And that's how it can work with the expectations that we present people. And if we are always talking about our books, we are creating expectations in the people we're talking to them about. If we're always like, oh yeah, this is so cool, especially if you're excited. I think this is what might happen when you're excited. So if you're really excited about your book and you're like, oh yeah, I've got this going on and this, and there's an awesome thing with this character, and then somebody reads it, they're like, well, this isn't... Excuse me. And somebody reads it and they're like, well, this isn't what I expected. You said it was really awesome, and it doesn't seem to be that as awesome as I thought. And this can be really difficult with endings, right? This can be really difficult if we set things up in our stories. So if you're writing a fantasy, if you're in the fantasy world, oftentimes fantasies are multiple books long, right? They're a fantasy epic. That's why Lord of the Rings is 3 books, even though it was 1 originally, but it is as big as 3 books. Lord of the Rings is 3 books at the very least. That's why Game of Thrones is longer than 1 book. That's why I would actually say that's why things like The Hunger Games is longer than 1 book. That's kind of in the fantasy genre. Harry Potter's longer than 1 book. What else is there? There's another one. Star Wars is longer than 1 book. It's often the case. I think I might be allergic to something. It's often the case that fantasies are longer because they're fantasy epics. They're not just a simple fantasy book. They're a bigger story. And it's often the case that the books are longer as well. And the reason, when you're writing fantasy, when you're writing book series and you're setting things up for the future, you better be sure you can make that pay off good, because you're building up tension with every single book that you're writing, right? You're setting things up, you're hinting toward things, you're bringing in more information, and you better make it really good as you go along, and it better build and build and build and build until you get to that final point where it's that satisfaction, where it's just like, man, that was a good ending. That's the ending that should have been the case. That terrifies me in terms of writing. But if you do that, that's the same thing. It's the same idea, but it's all within the book, so it's not as... It doesn't have the ability to go awry as much because you're not being explicit. Typically, when you talk to people about your work, you're being more explicit about it. Typically, when you talk to people about your work, you're being more explicit about it. But yeah, you can also turn people off by being annoying. How many of us know someone, right? We know someone who's like, I paint or I make music, and we don't like the person and we find them annoying. And because we find that person annoying, we read their stuff or we see their stuff and we're like, that's trash. We don't like that because we don't like the person, right? It's definitely the case that if you're too annoying with your writing, people might be like, I'm not going to help that person. I'm not going to support them because they're not fun. I don't like being around them. They always talk about this. They're annoying. And that's because you're spotlighting yourself instead of the work you're doing. And like I said, we need to spotlight the work we're doing instead of ourselves. And in some cases, we need to push the work out. I think all writers should view it like this. They should all be like, I've got to build my writing platform. I've got to push myself out. I've got to get myself in front of people, but it's not my favorite thing because my thing is writing, and I'm here so that people can find my writing. I'm not here so people can just look at me and hear me speak. The irony in this, total irony. I'm here because people are reading my writing. I'm not here for me. I'm here for the writing itself. With the hope that things will come back and there'll be benefits from the writing. But I think maybe it's something also we should develop in our attitude toward writing because it is a long slog. For the majority of writers, it is a marathon, and I think we should be aware of that. So most writers do an excellent job. I think most writers do an excellent job of being innocuous. And the reason why they do an excellent job of being innocuous is because they're usually introverts and they've usually developed a writing habit because they've got a lot of thoughts and they're stuck in a room by themselves or a cave by themselves, or they've been chained to a wall in the basement and they've given a pen and that's about it. So they write on their arm. I'm not someone who's innocuous because, as you can see, but most writers are. And I think that's good. But I think it's okay to be. If you're someone who's a writer and you're thinking, I should put myself out there more and I should tell people about my books more, it's probably the case that you should, right? If you're like, I don't like it, but I should, it probably is the case that you should. So do it. At the same time, be aware that how would I say this? Your default position of saying, hey, I'm a writer and I just want people to read my stuff. That's okay. Because the reason why you're writing is for people to read your stuff. The reason why you're writing is for people to read your stuff. The reason why you're writing is not for people, for people to be like, hey, you're so cool and yada, yada, yada. The reason why you're writing is for the writing itself because you have a story to tell. You love that story and you want other people to read that story. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.